I vividly remember the very first time I ever flew on an airplane. I was 13 years old. I was flying from Saginaw Bay City, Midland, Michigan, to Chicago, the O'Hare Airport in Chicago. I was 13 years old, and I was flying by myself. And I was really excited about flying, and I was really scared about flying. And so, the stewardess lady that is there at the front of the airplane, and she's doing all of the pre-boarding instructions, showing you the details that are contained on the laminated thing in the seat pocket in front of you. And as she was going through those instructions, I was hanging on every word she spoke. Okay. Now, all of us have flown a lot probably, and now often I'm asleep before the airplane leaves the runway. But that day, I was giving attention to what that lady was saying that morning. She's walking through where the mask will drop down in case we lose cabin pressure. And as she's walking through these instructions, I'm just assuming, well, of course, we're probably going to lose cabin pressure, so I better know where that thing's going to come down. And in case of a water landing, your seat cushion can be used as a flotation device. That is not particularly reassuring. In case of a water landing, okay, they can't say crash, I guess. In case we crash in the middle of the ocean, hopefully you can have the piece, the whereabouts to rip the cushion off of your seat and float in the middle of the ocean with it. Okay, they can't say that thing, so they say things like, in case of a water landing, your seat. Well, anyway, I had it memorized. When she was done, I had it memorized. And I had the motion sickness bag that is provided there in the seat pocket in front of you. I've never flown before. I have no idea what's going to happen to my body when that airplane lifts off the ground. And so I had the motion sickness bag open and in front of me. And it was a smaller airplane. There was a kid sitting next to me who was, I think, like exactly my age. And he was just looking at me. He's watching me watch the lady. He's watching me with the bag open in front of me. And so he says, "Is this your first time to fly?" And I said, "Yeah." And come to find out, they're talking with him like this kid was already a world traveler. He was like, this was one leg on his way to Europe or something like that. And so here's a guy who's done it lots before. It was my first time. But I was giving all of my attention to that lady that morning. This psalm opens with Asaph calling us to give that kind of attention to the words he's getting ready to speak. Verse 1, "Give ear, O my people, to my teaching. Incline your ears to the words of my mouth." Now, those instructions to me that morning ended up not being life or death necessity. I didn't end up needing to use those instructions that morning. But the instructions that Asaph is getting ready to give us are of a life and death significance to the coming generations. He calls for our attention. He says in verse 2, "I'm going to open my mouth in a parable. I will utter dark sayings from of old." A parable is a teaching, is an illustration that helps shed light onto a truth. And so Asaph is saying, "I'm going to illustrate my teaching for you." And then he uses this phrase, "I'm going to utter dark sayings of old." Well, what is that? He continues, verse 3, "Things that we have heard and known that our fathers have told us. These are the dark sayings of old." In fact, the rest of this psalm gives us those dark sayings of old, or these riddles. Some of you have family traditions that have been handed down with care from generation to generation to generation. It's probably a recipe, okay? Ours is seafood gumbo. That's the McMorris tradition that gets handed down from generation. My family is from Louisiana, and so seafood gumbo is the recipe, the tradition that gets handed down with care from generation to generation. Asaph is saying there are things that our fathers have told us that have been passed down with care, these dark sayings. Well, what were these dark sayings? What were these riddles? Well, the psalm goes on to tell us about them. And I would encourage you maybe later this afternoon to spend to spend some time in verses 9 through 72 of the psalm. It's a long psalm, and we won't take our time to read all of it this morning. But this psalm goes on to recount for us God's parting of the Red Sea for Israel. The cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night. The water from the rock. And yet, God's children sinned against Him and rebelled against Him. God provided manna from heaven and quail for their food, and yet God's people sinned against Him and rebelled against Him. God brought the plagues into Egypt and drove out the nations before them as they went into the promised land, and yet God's people sinned against Him and rebelled against Him. God gave them the promised land and established David as their king. And yet, God's people sinned against Him and rebelled against Him. So I think the riddles that this passage is teaching us are two. Number one, how in the world can God's people continue to sin and rebel against Him when they see His mighty hand involved in their lives? And the second dark saying, or second riddle, would be, how in the world would God remain faithful to these people? Asaph calls their attention to these things because he realizes the vital nature of what he's getting ready to command them to do. They have to get it. They've got to understand these things in order for them to pass these things on. My outline this morning is simple. Number one, we're called to listen. Number two, we're called to teach. And number three, we're shown the results. So first, Asaph has called us to listen. I've already covered that point. Now verses 4 and 5. We will not hide them from their children, but tell to the coming generation the glorious deeds of the Lord and His might and the wonders that He has done. He established a testimony in Jacob and appointed a law in Israel, which He commanded our fathers to teach to their children. What should we teach? Number one, verse 4, we're to teach the mighty works of the Lord. Look at verse 4 again. We will not hide them from our children, but tell to the coming generation. What are we going to tell the coming generation? The glorious deeds of the Lord and His might and His wonders, the wonders that He has done. Again, consider in context this psalm what Asaph is getting ready to recount. He's getting ready to talk about the parting of the Red Sea, the cloud by day, the pillar of fire by night, water from the rock, manna, quail being provided for them, the plagues of Egypt, driving out the nations before them, being given the promised land. These are the marvelous deeds that Asaph is recounting for the children of Israel and calling the children of Israel to be sure to teach to the coming generations the great things that the Lord has done. Author Ted Tripp says that we are supposed to dazzle the coming generations with the works of God. To dazzle the coming generations with the works of God. Were we, the children of Israel, walking through the wilderness and walking into the promised land, and we were to see these sorts of things, these amazing things that God has done, we would be dazzled by them, and we would want to dazzle our children with these truths of God. You don't have to be an entertainer or a college professor in order for you to do this with your children. Because God is dazzling. God does these mighty, wondrous deeds. And it's our responsibility as fathers to pass on these things to the coming generations. What wondrous works have you seen God do? What kind of provision or answer to prayer, protection, healing? What kind of things like that have you seen God do? And have you passed those things on to the coming generation? What's the most glorious and the mightiest and the wondrous deed that God has ever done for you? And for those of us who are His children, it's the same thing. It's the work that God did on the cross through His Son, Jesus Christ. Do our children know even our own personal testimony? If I were to ask your child, tell me your daddy's salvation testimony, would they know it? This is the mightiest and most glorious thing that God has ever done, the work of Jesus Christ on the cross. And this is the most important thing that we can hand on to our children. The gospel of King Jesus. This is what our children must get from us. Do your children know your own personal testimony? Not a testimony like, I went to a sermon, I was afraid I was going to go to hell, so I prayed a prayer, and now I'm going to heaven. A testimony like this. Daddy was once an enemy of God. And God overcame Daddy's sin and Daddy's position as an enemy. God overthrew Daddy's rebellious heart, and God saved Daddy. And now God keeps and a sanctifying Daddy. And all of this because of what Jesus Christ did on the cross. This is the most mighty work that God has ever done. And this is what we are to hand down to the next generation.